Do you want a gaming PC that won't break the bank, still looks great, and lets you play just about any game out there? If you said yes, this build might surprise you. I built this PC with one goal in mind, and that was balling on a budget. That means I shopped second hand to get the best price to performance for this computer. My total cost came to $430.66, and honestly, I overpaid a bit, so I'm confident that if you're in the US, you can build this PC for no more than $500. I'll go over all the parts that make up this build, show you how to assemble it, then we'll look at the gaming benchmarks, and a little spoiler alert, this thing is pretty good. Stick around so you don't miss anything, and at the end of the video, I'll share a full price breakdown of all of the parts so you can follow along with the build. The heart of this PC build is of course an AMD CPU. If you're using anything else when building a budget computer, you're simply doing it wrong. The CPU I went with is none other than the 6-core Ryzen 5 3600. It has 12 threads to handle multitasking and is equipped with 32 megabytes of L3 cache, which basically makes it the best CPU for the price. You can find it on eBay all day for around $60, and for that price you'll either get the stock cooler or you won't. And I recommend you don't pay any more than I did, and I'll share that in the price breakdown. Mine came with the stock cooler, but I'm deciding to use a budget RGB cooler from Amazon. The stock cooler will cool this Ryzen 5, but under load, this thing will hit 90 degrees, so the upgraded cooler will just help maintain the temperatures a whole lot better. And it will add RGB, and if you're like me and flip PCs for profit, better looks will always help. Now for the motherboard, I went with a simple AM4 board. You can go with something as cheap as like an A320, but I'd recommend the B450 chipset. I'm using the ASRock B450M Pro 4. It comes loaded with 4 RAM slots, 2 M.2 slots, and the rear I/O is pretty decent. It also has decent VRMs, so you could do some slight overclocking if you wanted. The only thing this motherboard is missing is onboard Wi-Fi, but Ethernet is superior anyways. If you need Wi-Fi, just look for motherboards that end with AC. You won't get air conditioning, but they will have onboard Wi-Fi. I'll have options linked below for a used motherboard, new one, and a new one with Wi-Fi if that's something you need. But now for the storage and RAM, these are parts you can just buy new because most of the time it's only about a $5 difference. For RAM, I'm using this Corsair Vengeance 2x8GB DDR4 kit clocked at 3600 MHz. Typically people will just use 3200 MHz, but the faster 3600 will give you better performance on the Ryzen 5 3600. So if it's not that much of a price difference, I'd recommend you get that. Luckily I got mine for pretty cheap. Now as for the storage, this is the first new part that I bought for this build. I'm using this Gen 3 King Spec 1TB M.2 NVMe SSD. It's around $60 brand new, and it gets the job done for super simple storage. I've used it about 10 times and never had any issues. Now the next part is the case. While you technically don't need a case, it definitely helps. The case is something I buy new 99% of the time, but I do look for the sales to save a little extra money. The case I'm using today is the good old Sama Q5. It comes equipped with 3 ARGB fans, which are all synced up through the included RGB controller. You can also control them with a button on the case, or even hook them up to your motherboard. This case is a great option for around $60, and it also comes in white if that's your preference. To power these components, I'm using the Gamdia 650 watt 80 plus gold power supply. 650 watts is more than enough to power this whole build, and it will allow the future buyer to upgrade to stronger components. I know a lot of people say to never buy a used power supply, so if you're a bit skeptical on it, I'll have a new option linked below as well. But if you do want to buy a user one, I recommend you also buy a power supply tester. The one I use is linked below, and it's a simple tool that just tells you if the voltages are in a safe range, basically if the power supply is good or not. But if you don't have your own experience with used power supply, don't just be scared because someone said don't buy a used power supply. Now the star of this whole PC build, the graphics card. I'm going with an option from AMD, and it goes toe to toe with the NVIDIA equivalent, and it's cheaper. The GPU I'm using is a legendary RX 5700 XT, and I have the super clean ASRock triple fan model. This GPU is rocking 8GB of GDDR6 video memory, and as I mentioned, it performs closely to an NVIDIA GPU, more specifically the RTX 3060 with 12GB of VRAM. Yes, the 3060 has more VRAM than the RX 5700 XT, but in games they're about neck and neck, and in some cases the 5700 XT beats it. You can buy the 3060 12GB for around 220 bucks, but I'd much rather save money and buy the 5700 XT for around 130. I'd like to know which GPU you would choose. Go and comment down below. Okay, this last part isn't necessary at all, but as a PC flipper, I always add cable extensions. For this build, I'm using some white and black ones, which were bought on sale on Amazon. But now let me show you how to put this thing together, then we'll look at the benchmarks, and I'll share that price breakdown with you. Starting off, you want to grab your CPU and remove it from the packaging if you have any. Then you'll notice on the CPU, it has a little gold triangle on the corner, and you'll also notice the motherboard has a little triangle in the same corner. You want to line those up, lift this lever up, and gently release the CPU into the socket, then push this lever down to secure it into place. You don't want to push on the CPU, it should fall into place on its own. Next thing is the RAM. This is something you will push on. Locate the RAM slots and push out the little tabs on slots 2 and 4, and the correct slots might be different for you based off your motherboard. You'll notice the RAM slots on the motherboard have a slightly off-center notch, and the RAM sticks also have the same notch. Line those two up and push firmly into place until you hear them make a click sound. Now for the storage, the NVMe SSD. These are so simple to install. Locate the M.2 slot on your motherboard, and just like the RAM, it has a notch and it can only go in one way, so be careful. Once you get it in place, just screw it down and bam, storage is installed. Now is when I like to install the CPU cooler. First things you want to do is remove the 2 stock mounting brackets from the motherboard, then open up your cooler and simply just follow the instructions to mount the cooler properly. Just make sure you don't forget the thermal paste, and also make sure you remove the sticker under the CPU cooler. Now we're basically halfway done with this build. The next thing is to get the motherboard into the case. Just take off the 2 side panels, grab the included screws, which come in their own plastic holder, and first you'll want to install the IO shield. Install it from inside the case and push it into place. With some cases you'll have to make sure the motherboard standoffs are in place, but this SAMA case has them in all the right places, so just lower the motherboard and making sure it's lined up with the IO shield, and then simply screw it down using these little screws that come in that little holder. Before installing the power supply, sometimes I like to plug in these case cables. That includes the front USB 3, HD audio, and the front panel connectors. HD audio almost always plugs in at the bottom left of the motherboard. The USB 3.0 goes in this fat plug, and there is also a USB 2.0 plug, and that almost always plugs in at the bottom of the board. The last cables are the front panel, and these almost always plug into the bottom right of the motherboard. After that, you can install the power supply. Just make sure the fan is facing down for fresh air, and you screw it into place with these bigger screws. And this is where you would plug in the cable extensions if you're using any. If not, then just plug in all the power cables like normal. The 24-pin power goes here, and the CPU power goes at the top left corner. Then you'll want to be sure to plug in the fan controller with the SATA power cable. And now finally, we can install the graphics card. You'll want to locate the PCIe slot and line up which of these brackets you want to remove. I'm removing 2 since I'm using a 2-slot GPU. And lower the GPU into place. You should hear it click just like the RAM. Lastly, screw it down and plug that bad boy in. Start off the benchmarking with a quick hop into Fortnite to see how the system was performing. You'd be surprised, but this game might as well be a AAA title. I started with 1080p all high settings and had anti-aliasing set to TSR high. Right off the bat, the first game was super stuttery, as Fortnite always is. It typically levels out by the 3rd game, and this PC was averaging around 60 FPS, which isn't bad considering the settings. However, the temps on the GPU were sitting above 90 degrees C, which is quite hot. As I mentioned in the intro, I overpaid on this PC, and the thing I overpaid on was the GPU. I bought it last year for a previous video, and I applied fresh thermal paste then, but let's see if we can't help this thing out anymore. I know this GPU naturally runs hot, but I've watched a lot of other benchmarking videos, and mine runs the hottest. So I shut down the computer and removed the GPU. The first thing I decided to do, of course, was take it apart and give the card a thorough cleaning. I used 91% alcohol, which I had in a spray bottle, and sprayed it all over the PCB. This does a great job of removing any grime or dust that could be preventing proper cooling, and it's great for getting thermal paste off. I let it soak for just a little while, then wiped it down with alcohol wipes to remove anything else. I also cut some new thermal pads to replace the old ones and kept cleaning with the alcohol. Now I'll be honest, I tested this GPU after cleaning and it kept crashing in the computer multiple times over and over again, and I thought I had broken it, so I just went to sleep. I didn't really want to think about it. I let the alcohol completely dry, and luckily it was working perfectly fine the next morning. I ran a 3D Mark Time Spy benchmark on this computer and got a decent score of 8,752. Now hopping back into Fortnite, we saw better results than before with the same settings, 1080p, all high settings, TSR high, and 100% resolution scale. Before, our GPU temperatures hit 90 degrees almost instantly. This time the temps rose more slowly. They did still reach 90 C, but mainly hovered in the high 80s. We ended up averaging 56 FPS. Personally, I'd rather have more performance than using high settings, so here's what I would do. Change TSR high to TAA, drop all settings to low, keep the far view distance on, and keep the resolution scale at 100%. With those settings, you'll easily be getting above 100 FPS. I averaged 128 with a 1% low of 83. And you can tweak the settings further to get even more performance. Now for a more demanding game, I tested Cyberpunk 2077. First, I ran the in-game benchmark at 1080p with all high settings and no resolution scaling to see the raw performance, and wow, I was actually surprised. We averaged 73 FPS, which isn't bad at all, and for the first time ever, I decided to actually play the game. I didn't expect to start in the same bar as the benchmarking tool, but that was pretty cool. After making it out into Night City, I was surprised about how good the game looked, and we were still averaging above 70 FPS. I should have played this game a while ago. I've had it since August of 2023, and it seems like a lot of fun. For another demanding game, I loaded up Helldivers 2. I set the game to 1080p with no resolution scaling, and I wanted to try all high settings. The game looked great, and the FPS was decent, but we were averaging under 60. I decided to switch from native 1080p to the balanced render quality option, and after enabling that, we instantly saw a nice FPS boost, averaging 81. The trade-off is a slightly softer overall look. If you want to use native 1080p, medium settings might be a better option. I also tested a few other games on this computer. Call of Duty Warzone at 1080p, all high settings, averaged 88 FPS. Rainbow Six Siege at high settings, averaged 176 FPS. Apex Legends at all high settings, averaged 162 FPS. Do you see a pattern with this PC? Yeah, 1080p, all high settings. This thing is a budget gaming beast and can handle most games at 1080p with high settings. Now for games that struggle to keep a steady FPS with high settings, it's great if they support any type of frame generation or resolution scaling, like with Helldivers 2, because you can just turn on a simple setting and get closer to your desired FPS. If you're interested in replicating this build, I'll have all the parts linked below, plus the top link is where you can buy my 1-of-1 build. And as promised, here is the full price breakdown for all of the parts and how much I paid to build this whole computer. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and smash the like button, subscribe if you loved it, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.